Good morning.
Good morning. Shavua Tov, everyone.
Good morning, Shavua Tov.
You can make Steve and I a co-host if you'd like. Isn't it nice of me to volunteer him all the time?
That is great.
You thrive on being good.
I'm going to rename myself with my proper name.
You're not Cantor Green?
I am not.
Okay.
They managed to actually do Tot Shabbat yesterday at 9 o'clock in the morning at the in the playground. It's like, yeah.
Nice.
I was so sure they were going to get rained out because there's like at that playground, there's kind of nowhere to go to be indoors, you know, to change your mind about it. But it worked out. It was good.
I love a nice Tot Shabbat. Was the weather amenable? Like, was it warm enough to be outside?
If you live in Portland, yes.
When it's dumping on you.
Yeah.
And I did speak with Rabbi Joseph about the Pride Parade today and our concerns, and she said that that people will be lining up for the Pride Parade with the temple at noon. So she didn't think that, she thought that if people wanted to do both, they would be able to. So I felt that I could go forward without conflicting with Pride. So I'm glad that there are folks who will be able to join us this morning and still make it to the Pride Parade in plenty of time, I hope. Okay, I don't want to waste any time. So thanks for those of you who are here this morning. It is great to see folks. Real quick, I'm going to start us off with the blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I have not, I was traveling when I ordinarily send my materials to Laura. So I'm going to put into the chat now the PDF.
Steve, are you going to rename Marv?
Sure, I can do that. Either one of us, doesn't matter.
Okay, so the document that I'm going to share with everyone today should now be in the chat box for anyone who wants to view it directly. And yeah, without further ado, we are going to jump into a little study of Jezebel. So let me go ahead and start by sharing my screen. And nope, I'm going to stop my share for a second. So before I jump in, I just want to ask what people's associations are with the name Jezebel. So if you have heard the name Jezebel used as a name for someone, what do you tend to think? Who or what is a Jezebel?
You know, I hear it all the time and I actually don't know what it means. I don't know what, I mean, I know it's negative, but I don't know why.
Great. We are going to get to the bottom of that today, Steve.
My mother used to use it for, shall we say, loose women.
Loose women, perfect. Direct quote. Welcome, Diane. I'm going to put again into the chat box the materials for today, just so that you have them handy if you want them directly. Great. So, okay, so we've got a loose woman and we've got, I don't know, I know it's bad, and I don't know why, which is a perfect jumping off point.
And there was a movie, and I think with Betty Davis, where she was like, she betrayed everybody.
Indeed,
Or
indeed.
a red dress.
Of course she wore a red dress. I mean, what color would Jezebel wear other than red? There's also a song by Edith Piaf, an Edith Piaf song called Jezebel. And although it's in French, if you translate the lyrics, they're pretty damning. Welcome.
If you don't translate the lyrics, they're damning.
I'm sorry, say that again, Steve.
I said, even if you
don't.
don't translate the lyrics, they're damning.
All
Damning for
right.
French speakers.
Fair enough, I guess. Maybe, I don't know. I like Edith Piaf. I have to admit, my favorite. I'm a writer, and my favorite music to write to is music that's in another language. So I love to write to Edith Piaf because I can put her on and not be distracted by whatever she's saying because I don't speak French. Okay, so I have put, again, for anyone who has joined in the last couple of minutes, I've put the materials into the chat box for those of you who want it directly. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share. And we're going to dive into Jezebel today. And we're going to start with what sort of the kind of universal preconceived notions about Jezebel are. So we start with this excerpt from a really excellent collection called Helpmates, Harlots, and Heroes by Alice Ogden Bellis. Can I ask for a volunteer who is willing to read for us just this introductory paragraph from the Alice Ogden Bellis? And if you want to volunteer, please raise your electronic hand, or Judith and Steve, if you notice anyone raising their real life hand, let me know. Okay, Julie, please. You can read just this introductory paragraph here for us.
From Helpmates, Harlots, and Heroes, Women's Stories in the Hebrew Bible by Alice Ogden Bellis. With Jezebel, we hit the nadir of biblical women, at least from the perspective of the biblical narrator. We also confront the biblical character who vies with Eve for the position of the most negative biblical female. To this day, the epithet Jezebel is applied to women who are thought to wear too much makeup or jewelry or sexually provocative clothing. Tina Pippin took an informal survey of college students, artists, and church members in her Southern context and generated the following list of phrases descriptive of Jezebel.
Great, thank you very much. So I will say that the idea of a Jezebel, of a woman being a Jezebel, is one that really has taken root in the American South in a way that it has more than it has in other places. And it's still very common today, very common for a woman to be called a Jezebel and for this to be the meaning that it has. So Steve, your hand is raised. I'm going to invite you to read this for us, but I want to ask, if you're going to read it, if you feel up to not exactly a dramatic reading, but if you can read this list with a little pizzazz.
I will give it my best shot and put on my actor hat.
Great, thank you. So this is everything that Tina Pippin, who, this is like a sociological research, and this is what her college students believe that the word Jezebel means.
Everything negative, wicked, scheming, whore, cheap, harlot, either promiscuous or a complete whore. Female form of gigolo. The name has seductive connotations. Biblical queen, wife of Ahab, gave her husband bad advice. Evil and treacherous, two-faced. One who seduces men and leads them to destruction. A woman who gets around, not ashamed, bimbo. I didn't know what it meant until my roommate called me this. Not me, but someone who is wild, free, and comfortable with her sexuality, uninhibited. Some might say slutty. A beautiful name, a Southern belle with a mind and a will and sex drive who is damned for not fitting the stereotype of a helpless, frigid woman. Scarlett O'Hara, Betty Davis in the red hoop dress in the 1938 film. Condescending term used for African-American women in the time of slavery. Jean loves Jezebel. You're a Jezebel. A flighty girl, light, flighty. Aloof or dirty slut. Free spirit, happy, cute, very feminine, always a lady, but not always so nice. Slinky, powerful, ambitious, calculating, ruthless, eaten by dogs. Taking pleasure from material things. Self-centered, decorated, woman. Painted face, Cosmo clothes, sensual. She has been given a bad rap by many scholars and people. She is famous for her badness. Vamp, vampire, temptress, femme fatale, siren, witch, a woman who takes or ruins the life of another.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for that excellent dramatic reading.
Nicely done.
It was
You're
very, very
welcome. There you go.
great. Okay, so we have a bit of a range, but we have some pretty strong themes running through of what just your average group of Southern College students thinks of the word Jezebel. And so the question that I'm going to pose to us today, and that I want us to keep in the back of our minds as we are looking at the biblical story itself and at the actual character of Jezebel, is, does the biblical Jezebel deserve this reputation, right? So if what Jezebel has come to mean is synonymous with a loose woman, I'm going to put that in air quotes, a loose woman. Does Jezebel, the biblical Jezebel, deserve this reputation? Why or why not? And what did Jezebel actually do wrong in her story? So I'm going to invite us to kind of be the judge and jury for Jezebel ourselves, instead of taking Jezebel as history has handed her to us. So with that, we will turn and begin reading the biblical tale of Jezebel. I call this the biblical tale of Jezebel in 4 vignettes because Jezebel's book unfolds across many, many, many chapters of 1 and 2 Kings. Her story unfolds across many chapters of 1 and 2 Kings. We're not going to read them in their entirety, but we're going to read the 4 most formative elements of her story that really tell us who Jezebel actually was, what she did. Great. So Judith, I'm going to invite you to read for us this first vignette from 1 Kings chapter 16.
Ahab became king of Israel and reigned for 22 years in Samaria. And Ahab did evil in the sight of Yah more than all who preceded him. It came to pass, as if it were a light thing, that he followed the sinful example of Jeroboam. He married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Phoenicians, and he started to serve Baal and worship him. Ahab erected an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria, and Ahab made a sacred Asherah pole. He did more to vex Yah, Elohim of Israel, than all the kings of Israel before him.
Great, thank you. So this is the introduction that we get to Jezebel in her story, that she marries Ahab, who is an Israelite king, and that she is a foreign princess, and that when she comes, her husband starts to serve Baal and worship him, and that Ahab erects an altar to Baal in the temple, and that Ahab made an Asherah pole. So this is the introduction that we get to Jezebel, and it paints a picture of what happens from a societal perspective when Jezebel comes as a foreign princess to marry an Israelite king. So this is the first vignette. This is the introduction to Jezebel. Can I get a volunteer to read the excerpt from the second vignette, which comes from 1 Kings 18 and 19?
Come on, people, hands.
I have
I'll read.
patience. Please.
I'll read. While Jezebel was butchering the prophets of Yahweh, the prophet Elijah gave orders for all of Israel to gather around him on Mount Carmel, and also the 400 prophets of Baal who eat at Jezebel's table. Elijah stepped out in front of all the people and said, "If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal, follow him." But the people had nothing to say. Elijah then said to them, I alone am left as a prophet of Yahweh, while the prophets of Baal are 450. Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to a battle of godly powers. The prophets of Baal failed to showcase Baal's power. When Yahweh's fire fell and consumed Elijah's burnt offering, when all the people saw this, they fell on their faces. Yahweh is God, they cried, Yahweh is. Elijah said, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." They seized them, and Elijah took them down to the Kishon and there he slaughtered them. When Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had put all the prophets to the sword, Jezebel sent a message to Elijah to say, "May the gods bring unnameable ills to me and worse ills too, if by this time tomorrow I have not made your life like one of theirs."
Great. Okay, thank you. So what happens in this second vignette? What exactly is the story that's unfolding here at this moment in the larger narrative? What do you understand of what's happening here?
Well, if I remember the rest of the stories, then about they have to like basically point their hands at something, turn and make it get on fire. And the prophets of Baal can't do that, but Elijah can do that.
Right. So I tried to condense this very lengthy scene here with these brackets, that Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to a battle of godly powers, and the prophets of Baal fail to showcase Baal's power. Then our God, Yahweh, proves God's self by raining down fire, etc. Yes. So there is this great display of who is the actual powerful God. We have Jezebel, and Jezebel has the 400 prophets of Baal who eat at Jezebel's table. That's one side of the scene, one group. And we have Elijah and Elijah's prophets and the worshipers of Yahweh. And Elijah is saying, actually, Yahweh is the strong God, and I will prove it to you. And challenges them to this sort of a battle, and proves that Yahweh is the actual powerful God. And in the end, the people say, Yahweh is God, Yahweh is God. So Elijah wins. And what happens next?
Well, can I ask, what does it mean, the opening sentence, while Jezebel was butchering the prophets?
Yeah, great. It means exactly what it says. During the period of time when Jezebel was butchering the prophets of Yahweh, Elijah challenges her to this battle. So this is, again, a much longer section from Kings 18 that I condensed for the point of making the narrative about Jezebel clear. But the larger picture that's happening here is that there is a religious war unfolding between the worshipers of Baal and Asherah on one side and the worshipers of Yahweh on the other. And that's a sort of, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just gonna say, all I really, the word butchering, it really, you're using it, or the way it's used here, it does refer to killing people. It's not like butchering, like
100%.
bad mouthing. It refers to like killing the prophets of Yahweh.
It 100% refers to the killing of the prophets of Yahweh. So what we have here is Jezebel is murdering prophets of Yahweh. And that's how the scene opens. That's how this moment in history opens. And then how does this moment in history close at the end of here of 1 Kings 18?
Elijah wins.
Okay, but what specifically does Elijah do?
Elijah's butchering them.
Yeah. So we start with Jezebel butchering prophets of Yahweh, and we end with Elijah slaughtering prophets of Baal, right? I think that that's really important to pay attention to when we're thinking historically about what's actually happening in this moment, right? Because this is one of those instances of we're the victors, we're the ones who write this story. You know, I always think of Elijah as, you know, the person that we open the door for and set out the wine for and put a chair out for, like literally inviting the man into my home every Passover. But when you actually read this story of what Elijah did, Elijah is a brutal warmongering prophet, as is Jezebel. And the real conflicting forces in the story of Jezebel is not King Ahab against Elijah. It's really Jezebel against Elijah. And this moment here really helps us to kind of see that that's what's happening. But from a literary perspective and from a perspective of understanding what is the greater scene against which the drama unfolds, it's that Jezebel is killing all of the prophets of Yahweh, And Elijah slaughters all of the prophets of Baal, and that's really the kind of religious war that we're engaged in at this point. Right. And then when Ahab tells Jezebel what's happened, when Ahab tells Jezebel that Elijah has slaughtered all of the prophets of Baal, she curses him and says, may the gods bring unnameable ills on me and worse ills too, if by this time tomorrow I have not made your life like one of theirs. So she curses him and she threatens to kill him. We won't look at it now, but immediately what Elijah does after this moment is run away. He runs away and he hides for a good portion of the story because he's afraid of Jezebel, which shows how powerful she is as a political leader, that he actually believes that she's going to kill him. Rightfully so, because she starts here by butchering the prophets of Yahweh. So that's the second vignette. Can I ask for a volunteer to read for us the third vignette, 1 Kings chapter 21? Yeah, Diane.
Naboth of Jezreel had a vineyard close to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Ahab said to Naboth, give me your vineyard so that I may have it for a garden of herbs, since may I have it for a garden of herbs, since it is right next to my palace. I will give you a better vineyard in exchange, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever its value. But Naboth replied, Yah forbid that I should give it to you, what I have inherited from my ancestors. Ahab came into his house sullen and resentful because Naboth's answer. He lay on his bed and turned his face away and would not eat. Jezebel came to him. Why are you so depressed, she said, that you won't eat? He told her, I spoke to Naboth and proposed that he sell me his vineyard, or if he preferred, I would give him another vineyard in exchange. But he answered, I will not sell you my vineyard. Jezebel said, some king in Israel you are, brighten up and eat. I will get the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and scaled them with his seal, sending them to the elders and nobles of Naboth's town. She wrote in the letters, proclaim a fast and seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people. Seat 2 scoundrels opposite him who will accuse him, saying, you have cursed Elohim and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. The elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's town did as Jezebel directed in the letters that she had written and sent to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth at the front of the assembly. The 2 scoundrels came and sat opposite him. They confronted him and charged, Naboth has cursed both Elohim and the king. Then they carried him outside and stoned him to death. Word was sent to Jezebel, Naboth has been stoned and is dead. As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, go now and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, for he refused to sell you, for Naboth is no longer alive, he is dead. When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab set out for the vineyard to take possession of it.
Great. And then you can read just this last little piece that I put at the bottom.
When Elijah heard of this, he cursed the house of Ahab, and of Jezebel he said, the dogs will devour Jezebel in the field of Jezreel.
Great.
2 Kings 21:24.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to stop my share for a minute just to ask what we understand has just unfolded. What is it that happens in this vignette?
Ahab comes off like a toddler. Like, I mean, seriously, he's cranky. He goes to bed. He won't talk to anybody. He won't eat. And mommy's got to come and do something about it so he'll be okay again. Yeah, he really comes off as a weakling. He doesn't order anything to happen.
Are, she says, right?
Some king you are.
It's
and
not the proudest moment
to the rescue.
Yes. Okay. So Ahab, instead of taking action himself, is sort of pouty about the fact that he can't get what he wants. I think we can definitely question whether being pouty about the fact that you can't get what you want or getting what you want the way that Jezebel goes about getting it, which of those paths is the better one to go down. But yes, okay, great. So Jezebel says, "Some king you are," and then what does she do?
Well, she has him assassinated, and pretty much it has so he can get the vineyard he wants. But of course, Ahab is letting her do it, so it's all right under his nose, so he's allowing it.
Yeah, very interesting question that scholars have grappled with about whether Ahab knows what Jezebel does in his name. She uses his seal, and you were right; it said the word "scaled," but it's a typo from the from the e-book version. It should be she sealed it with his seal. Yeah, very unclear whether he knows what she does under his name. And there's even a line of scholarly thought that thinks actually, because the letter was written apparently in Ahab's hand and by his seal, that actually in the original version of the story, Ahab was the actor who did this crime in the first place. And that later, in order to further vilify the character of Jezebel, that the redactors changed the story to make it look like Jezebel's the one who did the action. Those are just different hypotheses. From this, on the face of the story itself, Jezebel is absolutely the one who sends out the letter under Ahab's seal. Okay, she has him assassinated. Great. How does she do it? She calls false witnesses against him. She gets a couple of people who are willing to serve as false witnesses and say something that doesn't actually happen, that results in him being stoned to death. Is there another story that this vignette is reminiscent of in biblical literature?
Isn't there a prophet stoned to death in another?
That is a good question. I do not know the answer to that question. I don't recall there being a prophet stoned to death, but that does not mean that there's not a prophet that's stoned to death. I'm thinking of a story with a letter and someone who is killed so that something that he has can be taken away from him. And then the murderer has blood on his hands.
Oh, that's David and Bathsheba.
Yes, absolutely. There are elements of this vignette that are very reminiscent of the story of David and Bathsheba. And in both stories, the person who wrongfully commits the crime and has blood on their hands bears some pretty severe consequences as a result of their behavior. And the biblical authors want us to know that people cannot do something like this and get away with it. So in this case, what is it that, so remember, by the way, in the last scene, Jezebel cursed Elijah, right? She cursed him and she said she would come after him, but first she cursed him. And then here, after this behavior, he curses her. So from a literary perspective, we start to see them as characters. We start to see really just how on par Elijah and Jezebel are with one another as characters. They both have the power to curse one another and they both use those curses. And so here, Elijah curses Jezebel and says, "The dogs will devour Jezebel in the field of Jezreel." So I will share my screen again, and we will go ahead and read the fourth vignette and see how Elijah's prophecy comes to pass. So can I ask for one more volunteer to read for us the final vignette from 2 Kings chapter 9?
Eve had her hand in the air before. Eve, do you still want to read? Eve? Perhaps not.
Yeah, Tabitha, please.
Unmute.
Right. 30. When Jezebel heard that Jehu had come to Jezreel, she painted her eyes with kohl and adorned her head. She appeared at the window. As Jehu entered the gate, she called out, "Is all well, Zimri, murderer of your master?" He looked up at the window and said, "Who is on my side? Who? 2 or 3, I don't know that word, sorry.
That's okay, eunuchs.
Eunuchs, oh, of course. Look down at him. Throw her down, Jehu said, and so they threw her down, and her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses as they trampled her. Then he went inside and ate and drank. He said, "Attend to that cursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." So they went to bury her, but all they found of her were her skull, feet, and hands. They went back and reported to Jehu, and he said, "It is just as Yah spoke through Elijah the Tishbite. The dog shall devour the flesh of Jezebel in the field of Jezreel. The carcass of Jezebel shall be as dung on the ground in the field of Jezreel, so that not one will be able to say this was Jezebel."
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So what happens in this final vignette? First of all, Jehu is the new king that's going to come to power. So by this point in the narrative, the curse that Elijah put on the house of Ahab, during which he said, that Jezebel would be eaten by dogs, the curse was that all of the line was going to be wiped out. And it has come to pass. Ahab has been killed. Ahab and Jezebel's sons have been killed. And Jehu is the next Jewish king who is going to come to power after after Ahab. And so Jehu shows up at the palace where Jezebel's family has been killed, but she is still alive. And she is standing in the window of the palace. But before she comes to the window to face Jehu, to face the man who has killed her family and who is going to take over the crown of her husband, before she goes to face him, she paints her eyes with kohl and adorns her head, and then she appears at the window. She calls out, "Is all well, Zimri, murderer of your master?" I forget what the Zimri is, but this is a name or a nickname or an epithet that she's using for Jehu. She's addressing Jehu here. "Is all well, you who have killed your own king?" He looks up and he asks who is on his side, and 2 or 3 eunuchs, these are people who are in her palace who are there to serve her, throw her down, right? Jehu says throw her down, and her own men throw her out of the window. And then she meets this terrible, violent end. She's trampled, essentially at the end of the day, she's trampled by horses, she's eaten by dogs, and her body is almost unrecognizable, right? All that they can find of her after all of the damage is done is her skull, her feet, and her hands. Nonetheless, Jehu says that she should be buried, for she was a king's daughter. Did I include that in here? No. I did. Great. Yes. "Attend to that cursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." So she, although he does not like her and has wished this violent death on her and has participated in its unfolding, he still wants her to have the respect and death that she deserves of being buried like a king's daughter. And this is how Jezebel comes to her end. And this is how Elijah's prophecy is realized, right? So the dogs shall devour the flesh of Jezebel in the field of Jezreel is in fact what comes to befall her. So my question for you, now that we have read the story of Jezebel proper, or highlights in these 4 vignettes, is this: that the name Jezebel has come to be synonymous with a harlot, a hussy, or a loose woman. Does the biblical Jezebel deserve this reputation? Why or why not? From the story itself, as we have read it, what is there, if anything, that makes Jezebel synonymous with a harlot, a hussy, or a loose woman? And
I
now
would say
will
the only thing is that she painted her eyes, at the very end, that could have been a measure of it. But that's the amazing thing about it, is that the women who cause violence to happen are looked upon so negatively. Like Bathsheba, all the story, Rebecca, all of the stories about women, they're the bad guys. Even though what they did was exactly what the men were doing, it's just that they took the power.
Yes, very observant. Excellent. And we will dive deeper into both of the points that you made in just a minute. Yeah, Diane.
Yeah, there's no evidence that she was sleeping around. And even though she adorned her head and also her eyes with kohl, it doesn't act like she was, even trying to come on to the Jehu. I mean, which is interesting because you would think she would. I mean, if she was trying to be self-preservate, trying to preserve her life, let's get good with the new king. But she's immediately calling him out, which I think she knows is going to get her killed. So was she decorating her head and her eye in mourning? I don't know why she was decorating herself, and I don't know what her culture was, her background, but it doesn't look like she was sleeping around. So these loose women hussing a harlot doesn't really apply. She wasn't a great, she was not the best woman.
And we will dive into that in a minute as well. I'm going to call on Steve, but before I do, I just want to make sure everyone on the call knows I can only see you if you raise your electronic hand. So if anyone is raising their real hand and I don't call on you, it's only because I don't see you. So either unmute yourself or raise your electronic hand if I don't call on you. Steve, please.
Yeah, all I was going to say is, Diane just said part of what I was going to say, which is, at least with what we read, there's nothing implying that she was, sexually promiscuous. I think that what she seems to be from what we read, she's our enemy, but she's a very powerful woman. She's a very powerful woman. She's more decisive than her husband. She makes things happen that we might not want to happen, or that we might not agree with her way of making things happen. But she's got a lot of power, and maybe just the way males interpret powerful women over the centuries has led to that powerful woman being described as something sexually powerful. But there's nothing that we read that implies that. She's actually as strong as Elijah. She just is our enemy.
Great. Okay, so far we haven't seen anything in the narrative itself that we would associate with the characteristics of one that would be sexually promiscuous, and therefore it's still unclear to us from the face of the text itself why the word Jezebel came to mean harlot. Yeah, Randy.
Well, I think, and maybe this was said, I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself, I'm sorry. I think the fact that she had the power to sway her husband to not be obedient to God, but rather to Baal. I think that is really what Jezebels are kind of bewitching and powerful. And that's why that's what the name means. And then from all of that comes, why were they like that? Then people put the envelope around them of being sexual or whatever. But I really think it comes from being powerful.
Okay, interesting. I think you're saying a couple of different things. One of them, the theory, the power is a thread that we've seen now in a few comments, right? That maybe a fear of women's power in some way came to be conflated with the idea of harlotry. I'm going to push you a little, Randy, on the idea that she seduced her husband into any of his behaviors. Just again, from the face of the text itself as it opens, Ahab became king of Israel and reigned for 22 years. And Ahab did evil in the sight of Yah. He married Jezebel. He started to serve Baal and worship her. Ahab erected an altar to Baal in the temple. Ahab made a sacred Asherah pole. He did more to vex Yah than all the kings in Israel before him. I wonder what it is from the text itself that makes you think that Jezebel seduced him to this behavior. Not from what you're reading between the lines, but from the text itself. Is there anything here that makes us think that Jezebel seduced him into this behavior?
If I understood it right, which is possible I didn't, I think it was after he married her that he started worshiping Baal. That's what I had thought. If I'm wrong on that, then tell me.
No, you're not necessarily wrong, but I'm going to invite you to think of this story through a modern lens, maybe to give us a little bit more, leeway for Jezebel. Not that she deserves it in the long run of her story. And again, we're going to be her judges and we're going to decide that. But think of this as a marriage in 2022 between a Jewish person and a Muslim person. And what happens if, or think of it as a marriage like the marriage of my sister-in-law and her husband. My sister-in-law is Jewish, her husband is Catholic, right? If my sister-in-law, after marrying her husband, started to practice Catholicism, she didn't. They're raising their kids as cashews. But if she had started to practice Catholicism, would we say of Pat that he seduced her away from Judaism? Would we? I'm inviting us to think of this relationship as an interfaith relationship, and to understand that, sometimes in interfaith relationships, people go one way or another. I actually usually see it going the other way. I see most interfaith relationships come to have more Judaism, but yeah, Diane.
Mhm.
That is interesting when you're saying that, because I think I've converted to Judaism, but I think if I had married, my family history is Baptist, if I had married somebody who was Jewish, they would have seen that as
Right.
somebody drawing
That
me
you
away.
had been, yeah. And how would
Taken
you
away.
have felt? How would you have felt if you had married a Jewish person and had started bringing Judaism into your life, and then you were treated by your family or your community, or your husband or wife or partner or whatever was, treated in that way? I think that there's more nuance to this story than we tend to receive it because of the way that we receive it as Jewish people, as part of a book about how Judaism is meant to be practiced.
Well, I'm also wondering if part of it is because society still has that vision of Jezebel. A lot of today's society is also tainted by the Christian view.
Mm-hmm.
That's really part of why we see Jezebel in such a negative way as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I do want to get us to where we actually came.
May I?
Yeah, one second, Randy.
I want to give an example, one little example. I married a man and I thought we were interfaith because he came from a quote Christian background, but it turned out it was much easier than interfaith because he loves Judaism and never looked back. But I was looked at as the Jezebel by his family.
Great,
very,
excellent.
very, very much so. Very loose. I was from Chicago, and all kinds of other stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that perspective can actually help to give you empathy to the character of Jezebel, right? So if you married someone and you fell in love with him and he fell in love with Judaism after he married you, but you were seen as a Jezebel for introducing him to these loose ways of the Jewish people, I think that experience can give us empathy for Jezebel's perspective. And it's like, what if your in-laws, like the family, wrote the story and they got to write your story, right? That's essentially what happens to Jezebel. We, the in-laws, we get to write her story, right? And then it plays out in the long court of history. Steve, I'm going to invite you for one more comment, and then I want to move us on to where we actually came to the idea of Jezebel as a loose woman.
So I just wanted to say that, looking at it from that 21st century lens, I'm in an interfaith relationship that's been together for 33 years. And I like to say, gee, our relationship's been alive longer than Jesus. But anyway, neither of us converted to the other's religion, and yet we were able to have a great life together. And that doesn't mean, so in that respect, no one, including my wife's very religious Christian family in Texas, no one ever tried to convince me I should change. And no one in my family ever tried to convince her she should change. And I guess, so my point is that I too, like Randy, made the assumption that, oh, look, she married a Phoenician who believes in Baal. Therefore, he must have converted or whatever because of her. But the reality is that I think he's making personal choices and personal decisions, and when we do what Randy's in-laws did and hold it up and say, well, it's her fault. It's not her fault. He has, he even if he was influenced, he still has, he still has to take personal responsibility, right? And so it's not necessarily Jezebel that made him do these things, because even if she did those things, he didn't have to.
Right.
Chose
Excellent.
to.
Yeah. Great. Thank you all. I really appreciate your being willing to consider the evidence from multiple perspectives as we serve as Jezebel's judge and jury today. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen again. And we're going to now hone in and take a look at why and how Jezebel's name actually came to be synonymous with harlotry. Is there anyone who wants to read this little excerpt for us from Listen to Her Voice?
Eve, do you want to read now? You wanted to read before.
Yes. Jezebel is mistakenly remembered as a harlot because she painted her face before going to her doom. Jezebel's final act was so to wring her eyes with kohl and adorn her hair. She prepared to look her best, as any royal person would be before an encounter with the public. In addition to being considered a seductress because of her association with the sexual customs of the goddess religion, Jezebel is thought of as a harlot because in 16th century England, painting the face was evidence that a woman had loose morals. It was during that time that Jezebel came to mean a wicked woman.
Great. Thank you very much, Eve. Yeah, so a few important things that unfold and are illuminated for us here, right? So first of all, a couple of us posited, and Diane in particular, I remember you talking about like, why? I'm not sure why she painted her eyes with kohl, right? Here we have at least one perspective on why she might have done that she knew she was going to her death and she was a queen, and that she wanted to be regal unto the last minute, right? To show her pride as she went to meet her death. It reminds me very much of how I imagine the death of Anne Boleyn. That right before she's going to go and lay her head on the scaffold, she's going to pull herself up to her full height, and she is going to stand there knowing that she's going to her death wrongly, and that she wants the world to see her as a queen, even in her final moments. That is the picture that I get of this Jezebel. And kohl, by the way, is the ancient and still used in the Middle East today precursor for eyeliner. Kohl is a kind of chalk that you smear on your eyelid, like eyeliner. So yeah, she maybe wanted to look her best before she was going to meet her death. And remember, at this point, her husband had been killed by this person. Her sons had been killed by this person. She knew exactly what she was going to face at that window. So that's just an interesting perspective on the why she put eyes on her kohl at that, why she put kohl on her eyes at that moment. Then we have this sentence that's not a throwaway, and I just want to spend 1 minute on it. In addition to being considered a seductress because of her association with the sexual customs of the goddess religion. Okay, so what does that mean before we throw it away? We've talked about this in some Torah study sessions this year, and it will come up again. In biblical literature, harlotry and prostitution is often synonymous with goddess worship or with polytheism, with worship of another god. So it doesn't always, in biblical literature, necessarily mean what we think of as a kind of sexual looseness at all. Often harlotry, specifically harlotry in the biblical text, is actually a euphemism for idolatry. Okay, so the fact that we know that Jezebel is idolatrous, we know that she's a worshiper of Baal and Asherah, that could have earned her a general reputation as a harlot in the biblical age even, and in the years that followed, not meaning sexually promiscuous, but meaning idolatrous. So that's just an important piece of the puzzle, but really what it comes down to in terms of why college women in the South today think of a Jezebel as a harlot, a loose woman, that lovely long paragraph that Steve read so beautifully and dramatically for us earlier. The fact that today that's what Jezebel means is what we think of as a harlot, not what they thought of as it biblically, but that what we think of as a sexually promiscuous woman, that actually came to be the meaning of the word Jezebel because of 16th century England. Because in 16th century England, any woman who wore makeup was considered a woman who had loose morals. In that point in history, it really was only the actual prostitutes who were painting their faces. And therefore, when Christians were reading the story of Jezebel in 16th century England, they said, oh, she painted her face. She was a prostitute. They weren't even actually necessarily reading the Bible themselves, right? Often they're receiving the Bible through their preachers, etc. They may never have sat down like we are and actually read the story of Jezebel to take a look at what behavior unfolds in her story. All they needed to know is that she painted her face, therefore she was a loose woman. And that is why today, in 2022, it still has come to be synonymous with a woman of loose morals. Any thoughts or questions on that mystery solved, right? We didn't know we were gonna have a mystery this Sunday. That's fun. Any thoughts or questions about this before we move on? Okay, so then I'm gonna ask you the really, I think, key question that this is the last thing I'm gonna ask of you as we are serving as the judge and jury of Jezebel. And then hopefully we'll have time to read a poem or two. But I'm gonna ask this question and then I'll stop the share so that we can talk about it looking at one another. But so what did Jezebel actually do wrong in her story? If her problem isn't that she was sexually promiscuous, we could debate whether or not that's a problem, but that's what history has decided her problem was. But if we're going to decide what behavior did Jezebel engage in that's actually wrong, that is what I'd like us to judge her for today. If we're going to walk away from this and make our own decision about Jezebel as judge and jury, what did Jezebel actually do wrong in her story?
Falsely accused.
She murdered our prophets.
She falsely accused.
Okay. We got it. Falsely accused, murdered our prophets. What else? Or other thoughts or seconding any of these? What are we going to convict her of and put her away for?
She falsely accused that man.
Yeah, Naboth. She falsely accused Naboth over the vineyard. Okay. So I think we have two strong contenders. I'm not saying that they can't be both. Okay. We have two strong contenders for what Jezebel actually did wrong here. Yeah, Diane.
Well, I just figured out the thing with Zimri, why she called Jehu Zimri.
Okay.
Was threatening him. Because Zimri, it was actually the two reignings before him, before Ahab.
Okay.
And also for a short time. So she was actually threatening Jehu that she was going to have him taken out within him.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. So she threatens a few people, right? She threatens Elijah. She threatens Jehu. Okay. Great. Okay. But we're probably not going to put her away for that in like the hierarchy of what did Jezebel do wrong. So the two big things that she does wrong, or that we're, at least as we're sitting here on the bench together as her judges, that we're willing to debate whether we're going to convict her of. One of them is killing the prophets of Yahweh. And one of them is the Naboth vineyard incident. So I am going to ask if anyone would be willing to come to Jezebel's defense in the incident of the murdering of the prophets of Yahweh. Is there anyone who could make a case for why that is not the worst thing she does and what we're willing to convict her of? Yes, Diane.
I think that in the chapter before, wasn't Elijah having a drought come to the land? And so maybe she thought the prophets were doing that and she was trying to get rid of the prophets.
Okay, so great. But I'm going to ask you just to judge on the evidence presented before you today, have to make decisions based on evidence that wasn't introduced into court today. But yes, there's a drought in the background. There's a larger political, regional, and religious battle that's happening between Elijah and Jezebel before she starts. She doesn't just arbitrarily start killing the prophets of Yahweh. So if you are going to make a case in her defense, if you're her defense lawyer today, what might you say as to why that's not the worst thing that she does in the story?
If it's not the worst thing she does, well, then I'd say the worst thing she does is bring false witness.
Right. I think that we will get to convict her. I think we will get to convict her for the Naboth incident.
Right.
I'm going to say that I'm going to invite you to think of what happens between Jezebel and Elijah and the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Yahweh in the same way that I invited you to think of what happened when Jezebel married Ahab. That I want you to see if you can shift your perspective and think about who writes the story in the end and why we decide that that's one of the terrible things that she does, or why it might not be as bad through that lens. Like, broaden your scope and think about both sides of that particular story and see if you can come to her defense at all.
If we're not gonna, if we were gonna convict her of killing our prophets, then why would we let Elijah off for killing all of their prophets? I think she really gets the, hey man, it's a war going on here, and I didn't do anything worse than you guys did. So, I mean, unless we want to have a double standard for her because, yeah, we happen to like our prophets better, she loses out.
I think another thing is she was protecting her religion, and this Elijah guy was just really telling her that all of her prophets were wrong. And on her defense, Elijah and all of his prophets were wrong.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Samil.
Well, if we think about this in the context of the quote unquote rules of war, she took action for her side, so to speak, that her husband, who conceivably should have been the military leader in this context, she took action. And is it all that different from what we read last week with Yael?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, right. Because the question about the story of Yael is, why is she a hero? She's a hero because we wrote the story. Why is Jezebel so wicked for murdering the prophets of Yahweh? It's because we're the ones who write this story, right? So I think that yes, I appreciate that a few of you were willing to come to the bench and defend Jezebel on this particular charge, in that this is a religious war, it is a war, and that at the end of the day, the same number of prophets of Baal get murdered as prophets of Yahweh. And we actually have two sides coming to the table engaging in the same activity. Are we willing to hold Elijah to the same standard that we're willing to hold Jezebel to through that lens, is something that we at least have to ask ourselves. Yeah, Diane.
Well, this happened in England all the time, back and forth, when the kings, went back and forth on their religious beliefs. If they went, the Catholic, if they decided to be Catholic or Protestant, I mean, their alliance went back and forth, and then who was in power in terms of the priests or the, Protestant, that then they got out of, killed or out of power.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we
back and forth according to the whims of the royalty.
Yes, absolutely. And I am, by the way, obsessed with Tudor England. Just fun fact, that is my nerdy thing that I do in my free time, is read as much historical fiction about Tudor England as I possibly can. But yeah, today in 2022, we're willing to look at Tudor England, and we're willing to say the murdering that was done by Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth of all of the papists, was terrible, and the priests who were killed, etc. And likewise, all of the murdering that was done on behalf of the Catholics, of the Protestants, just absolutely awful. And it was a religious war. And so we can map that we can grasp, right? Especially as Jews, we can say, well, okay, that's like a war between Christians, so it gets over there. We can actually map that onto what happens here and see this also as a religious war. And so I would say I'm less willing to convict her for that than I am for the Naboth affair. The fact that she brings false witnesses against someone and has him murdered so that she can steal his land is, at the end of the day, the only indefensible thing in the story of Jezebel. Yeah, Steve.
Well, I was just going to say that when it comes to the false witness thing, not bringing it into the 21st century, but bringing it into like the rabbinic times, I don't think, like, if you were to look at the Talmud, I'm sure there's lots of things about war in there, and what's right and just. But one thing we know is that there's a ton of writings about the Adin Zomamim in bringing false witness, and those people who bear false witness, being punished as much as the person who a crime. Like if you're supposed to stone somebody to death, the false witnesses may bear that same consequence. So I think that in Jewish law, it seems that there is justification for saying that the false witness is at least as bad as murder, and that there is no military justification for false witness. There is only the desire to own somebody else's stuff.
Yes. So 100% Judaism has a lot to say about false witness. And you're right that it unfolds in the Talmud and that it can enrich our reading of this story. And the rabbis hated Jezebel. So when we read this story through the rabbinic lens in general, it can both help us to understand just how bad the false witness part was, but it makes everything else look even worse than it is in the biblical story as well. She is just, if she's eaten by dogs in the Bible, she is eaten by dogs in a metaphorical way by the rabbis. Yeah, Diane.
I'm just not convinced that was totally her. That Ahab was sitting there. I think you have servants that are going to tell you. He had to have known for full well.
And some scholars. Yes, you are not the only one who is not. And so, Diane, in the court, you might say, even in a both affair, you're willing to serve as the defense attorney for Jezebel. And then the evidence that you might bring is that she wasn't actually the one to write the letter, that the seal was his, and actually put it on Ahab instead of Jezebel. And you might win. There are historians who would go with you. And on the face of the text itself, I think that what's important to remember is that all these conversations that we've had today about rethinking whether she seduced him into bringing Baal worship, and about whether what unfolds between her and Elijah is what she does is any worse than what Elijah does in the killing of the prophets, and the Naboth affair, all of those things that we've made our judgment about today, we've made them on the face of the text as we inherit the text. We don't even have to say, maybe the text is wrong in the way that it's presenting it, and we can still arrive at the conclusions that we arrived at. I actually land where you land. I'm a little skeptical of her having written the letter, but the Torah itself says that she wrote the letter. And so if we accept just the evidence that's entered into court as it's given to us in the Tanakh, the thing I think that we can condemn her for, the one thing we can condemn her for unequivocally on the face of the text itself, is the Naboth affair. And when we think of Jezebel, and when we talk of Jezebel, and when we teach Jezebel, when we share her story with other people, I think it's important to help people to understand that Jezebel was a bad actor, and she did a bad thing, and she killed someone, and there was blood on her hands for it. But that's the thing she did wrong. Not the fact that she was a powerful woman, not the fact that she introduced multiple faiths into Israeli society, and not the fact that she was promiscuous because there is absolutely no evidence of her promiscuity on the face of the text at all. We're already a few minutes over. We did not have a chance to read any poetry. I have to tell you, the poem that's in here by Jean Ann Verlee is just one of the best poems that there is, full stop. And it happens to be about Jezebel. So I really encourage you, after we're done today, to read the Jezebel poem in this packet by Jean Ann Verlee. It is phenomenal. I also included a poem that I wrote, not as phenomenal as Jean Ann Verlee's, but written from the perspective of Athaliah, who is a character who's believed to have been the daughter of Jezebel. So Jezebel's daughter looking back on her mother and what kind of a woman her mother was. So if you are curious to read a poem of mine, that's in there as well. There's also some fun headlines about Hillary Clinton as the modern day Jezebel from the time when Trump was elected, and thinking about how a woman can earn the epithet of Jezebel for being powerful rather than sexually promiscuous, and how that is another like how one of the things we're threatened about Jezebel is her power as a leader, a political leader, and how that still resonates with people, who are afraid of powerful women political leaders today. So there's a few more things we didn't get to in the materials. I will send them to Laura so that she can email them to you as well, but you have them here in the chat. That's it. Thank you all for going down the Jezebel judge and jury path with me today. It was fun. And I hope you all have a great Pride. Happy Pride today, everybody.
This was an awesome
I'm
story.
not going to the Pride parade, but I wore my Pride shirt anyway.
Bowie beer?
Oh, every year this beer company, Bowie Brewing, does a Pride shirt. See, this one has a rainbow.
Ah, yes, love it. Nice.
So it's like a little subtle, but
awesome.
And I totally get into the Tudors in the Plantagenets too. So
yeah, it's really good. Do you like Philippa Gregory? She's my favorite. Philippa Gregory. She's my favorite historical fiction author. I'm obsessed with her.
She's good.
Yeah. I have my ancestry traces back through both lines, so I had a fun time tracing back. So that was
nice.
I didn't know it when I first originally started looking into it, but my uncle traced it, so it was fun.
Nice. On my mother's side, my mother also converted to Judaism. On my mother's side, my mother is a butler, and the butlers of Ormond were family of Anne Boleyn. So,
okay. Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Very fun.
No, that is super cool.
Yeah.
Very, very, it's all fun. I mean, yeah, it's all fun. So anyway, thank you. Great time today. Loved
I'm
it.
so glad. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Zechariah was the other prophet.
It was stoned to death.
Yes.
Awesome. I always learn things from you, Diane. Your biblical knowledge has significant breadth.
No. I'm just a nerd. Okay.
I thought it was Saint Stephen. No.
Thank you, everybody. Shavua Tov. Happy Pride. Be well.
Thanks again, Sivan.